This chart shows that after 20 years of relative peace, armed conflicts are once again on the rise. And countries are investing in their armed forces again, with military expenditure reaching a peak of $2.4 trillion in 2023, the highest year-on-year rise since 2009.
Ici sont faites les charges. Et dans les charges, on met ces poudres.
On April 11, 2024, Emmanuel Macron opened a new production line at an ammunition factory in the south of France.
Et donc le choix industriel a été fait de relocaliser les poudres.
The powders he's talking about are explosive powders used in these weapons, which were previously made in countries like Sweden. These howitzer rounds have been critical in the defense of Ukrainian territory since the start of Russia's war in 2022. This relocation is part of a bigger move by the French government to ramp up production of military equipment, including propulsion systems, electronic equipment, and rubber tires. The government says the financial investment is aimed at filling depleted supplies, supporting high technology development, and the creation of new jobs. And that's the case across Europe. In Germany, arms maker Rheinmetall inaugurated a new factory in February of 2024 that will produce artillery ammunition, explosives, and rockets. Aerospace and defense company Kongsberg also opened a new anti-ship and cruise missile manufacturing plant in Norway the same year.
C'est pas demain l'économie de guerre, c'est là. Et on accélère encore.
But what does it mean to be in a war economy? And what are the economics of war? When you think of war, the first images that come to mind are likely to be these: the impact war has on human life, and rightly so. But economics often determine what leads to a war, who wins the war, and how countries function in the aftermath. Take the Acre War, for example, a border conflict which broke out between Brazil and Bolivia in the late 19th century. The Acre region was rich in rubber trees, and as production of bicycles, cars, and other means of transport ramped up, the latex cultivated and produced from the trees promised wealth to whoever controlled it. Bolivia would go on to cede the territory to Brazil after 4 years of bloodshed. When deciding to pivot towards a war economy, states must redirect resources and supply chains towards defense priorities. A common way to look at it is through the opportunity cost, guns versus butter analogy. The economic model describes the trade-off in spending between national defense and social programs. The curve illustrates how producing more guns means making less butter, and vice versa. And it's a massive trade-off when you consider just how expensive war is. One Javelin anti-tank missile costs about $178,000. Since 2020, at least 10,000 of these have been sent to Ukraine by the US alone, an expense of at least $1.7 billion. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs estimated in 2018 that the total economic cost of conflict and violence in the world reached $14.3 trillion, or 12.6% of global GDP. This figure rose to $17.5 trillion in 2022, or more than 17% of global GDP. To cover this cost, the state must play a bigger role in the economy, moving closer to what's called a centrally planned economy. This means a greater involvement in controlling labor, production, and the reallocation of resources. With the need to grow their troops, governments either turn to voluntary enlistment or conscription, a compulsory enlistment of people in the military. But this in turn reduces the size of available workforce, which weakens economic output as a result. In the short term, a war may appear to have a positive economic impact, thanks to low unemployment and big investment in large industries such as transport and technologies. But as soon as a state turns to a war economy, with the high cost for weapons and defense, and the depletion of workers unable to fulfill the demands for food and other items, prices start to rise. Warfare invariably leads to price hikes. Often, price hikes may also cause a shadow economy, with items being bought and sold underground. Take for instance Yemen, which has been at war since 2014. The sale of many everyday items is controlled by criminal networks, and there are reports of critical commodities like petrol being sold on the street in small containers at an inflated price. There are 3 ways for states to finance war: taxation, borrowing, and printing money. Known as tributum in ancient Rome, tax increases to support war are still common today. In June 2024, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the biggest tax hike in almost 25 years to fund his war on Ukraine. But governments also resort to borrowing, with compulsory or voluntary loans. For example, when Nazi Germany occupied Greece, it forced the Greek National Bank to issue a 476 million Reichsmark compulsory loan, effectively used to cover the cost of its occupation and military expenditure. Voluntary loans, or government bonds, are raised from the public, banks, or foreign loans. Finally, states can fund their war efforts by printing money, but this can result in inflation, and sometimes even hyperinflation. Look at this picture from 1923. A German woman is about to light a fire in her stove with marks, the German currency after World War I. At that time, starting a fire with millions of marks was cheaper than burning wood. In January 1923, a loaf of bread cost about 250 marks, but by November of the same year, it had jumped to 200 trillion marks. But are all wars bad for the economy? That depends on where the war is fought. An analysis of nearly 400 wars fought in the past 2 centuries found that countries involved in wars away from home may not see any significant impact to their economies. Wars also often lead to breakthroughs in technological innovation, from gunpowder to longbows, submarines, radar, and lasers. While public money is the main catalyst for developing new military products, the companies producing the goods are large beneficiaries. The 2 world wars saw French car company Renault and the American firm IBM reap the rewards of the war economy. The car manufacturer reoriented its production to trucks, tanks, plane engines and ammunition, and as a result, saw its revenue quadruple from 54 million francs in 1914 to 249 million francs in 1919. 20 years later, during World War II, IBM, famous for its data processing systems, added rifles, engine parts and bomb sights to its production lines. Its revenue jumped from $38 million in 1939 to $138 million in 1945. But the biggest winners in wars are defense companies, whose stocks and bonds, also called war babies, can thrive when a conflict happens. In 2023, when Israel was attacked by the terrorist group Hamas, the share price of Europe's biggest defense companies jumped several points in just 2 days. But is war really that good for business? Whilst Russia, at war since February 2022, did see its economy slow following the invasion of Ukraine, the IMF says the country's GDP should rise 3.2% in 2024, despite the military burden, pressures on the labor market, and international sanctions. But economists describe this kind of growth as the broken window fallacy. The concept argues that while repairing a window may seem to generate economic activity, the people and materials used to repair it could have been used elsewhere for more productive purposes. The same goes for the destruction coming from war, ultimately meaning a net loss for society.